Imagine watching your friend get eaten alive and there's nothing you can do to stop it. It was August 1981 on Ormond Beach in Florida. 21-year-old Tamara Ennis was a lovely young woman just enjoying her summer, honestly living the absolute dream. She worked as bar staff and was really sociable and would meet loads of new people constantly. She loved going to softball games and just hanging out with everybody that she met. On this one particular Sunday, she was out on the water on a catamaran with her neighbour and two friends. These were Daniel, Randy and Christy. They were around a mile away from the shore when suddenly Tamara noticed something in the sky. It seemed like dark clouds kind of circling and getting closer. It seemed really ominous and she started to get a bit worried. Then she noticed some water was getting into the boat and she really started to panic. But her friends calmed her down. They were like, look, this is a really small hole in this boat. We can go back to the shore and we can get it fixed. So they did just that. They easily went back to the shore. They got some tape. They covered up this hole. And Tamara ended up kind of thinking, was I just over-exaggerating here? The clouds seemed to calm down and they all had a few more drinks and decided that they would go back on the water. But things were about to get a whole lot worse. And this time a whole lot more water started filling into the boat. They hadn't fixed it as well as they thought they had. Suddenly, once again, they were all scrambling to fix this hole and they were a little bit further out this time, so it was a little bit more dangerous. And then, in amongst all of this, the boat just suddenly flipped and threw them all off. They were suddenly plunged into this freezing water, and one of Tamara's first thoughts was, God, I hope I haven't cut myself here, because obviously blood attracts sharks. Now, they all struggled for over an hour to try and fix this hole and get back on the boat and sail back to the shore, but no luck. And they were convinced by this point, like, surely somebody's going to notice that we're missing. Surely somebody, like a boat or something, will see that we're having real trouble here in the middle of the water. But time ticked on and nobody came. Then they had a glimmer of hope. It felt like they'd been out there for absolutely forever when they heard a helicopter. And not just that, they also saw a big boat approaching them. So they're like, oh my God, finally there's somebody coming to save us. But no matter how loudly they whistled, shouted, screamed at the top of their lungs, nobody came. Their helicopter circled round and flew back, and the boat seemed to just stop and turn round. It didn't even have any fresh drinking water. They were so thirsty. They were just hanging on to their sinking catamaran for honestly hours. And as the sun started to come up in the morning, they decided, we just have to get back to the shore now. They thought, we can't die out here. We're actually going to have to just make a swim for it. Despite being stung all over by jellyfish as they started to power through the water, they just knew they couldn't give up. But an hour into the swim, Tamara suddenly heard a scream. She glanced back like, what the hell is that noise? It was Christy. And Tamara said it was exactly like a scene that she'd seen on the film Jaws. Christy screamed shark and suddenly kind of almost like came right out of the water and then plunged back under. She then scrambled up, but Tamara could see her face and it was totally drained of any blood. Then bam, she was pulled back under again. Tamara just swam. She could see that the other two guys that she was with were swimming back to try and save Christy, but she was like, this is not looking good. She was like, I just need to focus, get back to shore, and then I can get some help. But the danger was far from over. As she swam like hell to get to safety, something smacked her leg and she looked down and she saw this big grey thing. She was like, I'm not hanging around to examine what this is. After 5 hours of swimming, she finally made it back to the shore and a lifeguard pulled her to safety. She had no idea if Christy had survived, if the other two guys had been attacked potentially. She'd been hallucinating the whole swim. It was just such a traumatic experience. Randy and Daniel, it turned out, both did make it back alive. Although Randy ended up in hospital with hypothermia. They had an absolutely horrific tale to tell. By the time they got back to Christy to save her from this shark, her leg had been ripped off. The blood just drained from her body and there was absolutely no saving her. They tried to carry what was left of her to the shore, but they just realised that it was making them far too tired. She was only 19 years old and to this day her body's never been found. You are fascinated by cases like this, like I am. I actually did a whole episode on the Born Investigation podcast about the case of the Lonegans. This is a couple that went on a diving expedition and then suddenly realised halfway through that expedition they'd been left. The boat had gone without them, leaving them totally alone in the middle of the sea. She ended up dead in suspicious circumstances after this appalling TV show was aired. Before we get into today's case, if you do want the deep dive of Miriam Rivera's tragic life and death, I have just posted it on my podcast, The Born Investigation. So let's talk about this insane show, because I honestly can't believe they even broadcast it. Miriam Rivera was born in Mexico and knew from day one she was born in the wrong body. She just knew she was meant to be female. She would always get mistaken as a little baby girl, and she was just stunningly gorgeous. But her dad didn't approve, and it was honestly sickening what he did. He basically got a pastor round to the house to effectively perform an exorcism on this child. She ended up running away, and I'm not surprised in the slightest. What kind of psycho does that to their child? And she really struggled growing up. She was relentlessly bullied and just not accepted by anyone. But by the early 2000s, she was growing in confidence. She'd had surgery to help her feel more feminine, and she was really shining. She looked absolutely incredible. She honestly was stunningly beautiful, like supermodel beautiful. That's when she got the opportunity of a lifetime to be the star of this brand new Sky One TV show, There's Something About Miriam. She gasped. She couldn't believe it. She was finally going to get the break that she'd always prayed for. She was going to be accepted into the mainstream and shooting in this gorgeous luxury villa in Ibiza. And not only that, it was a dating show. She was going to finally be able to meet a guy who accepted her for her. Except there was a catch. The producers were like, yeah, the whole premise of the show is basically these guys date you, they fall in love with you, and they don't realize you're trans. And we're not going to tell them until the big reveal at the end. They convinced Miriam though. They were like, this is going to be a good idea. It'll be really good for you to finally kind of come out to the world. You're going to be amazing. You're going to be a star. She had no idea the derogatory way that this show would treat her. They did some insane things. They got a doctor on the show to examine her bits to make sure that they were male bits. Like, what? And the trailer of the TV show was so disgustingly like mocking Miriam. The backing track was Dude Looks Like a Lady by Aerosmith. Safe to say, they just tried to make her an absolute laughingstock, and they tried to humiliate the guys too, as if it was something shameful to date a trans woman. They were like, oh yeah, these poor guys are not going to know that she's trans. Needless to say, during the filming of the show, these guys are getting to know this beautiful woman, and connections started to form. And by the end, she'd selected a winner, and essentially what was going to happen is she'd pick a winner, they'd go away on a luxury holiday for a week together and get 10 grand. To make it as dramatic and as humiliating as possible for everyone involved though, producers actually invited all of the eliminated contestants to be there for the final. And Miriam was made to announce to these guys that she was trans by reading off a script that they had written for her. Their words, not Miriam's words. She was made to say to these men, I love being a woman, but I'm not a woman. I was born as a man. As you can imagine, early 2000s, immature guys, they started laughing in the face of the guy that won. One even shouted, I knew it, and was kind of pointing and laughing like it was just a big joke. And Miriam was stood there honestly just humiliated, waiting to see if he still wanted to go on the holiday with her. And the guy also really didn't know what to do. He was kind of like, right, is this just like one big prank? He actually never ended up going on the holiday he'd won with Miriam, and the fallout from the show was insane. The men ended up suing the TV company, and Miriam was just blasted all over the tabloids like this big villain. But if you thought that that was traumatic, just wait. Because years later, she would end up surviving a murder attempt and then was found dead in very suspicious circumstances. The official story is that she unalived herself, but I have done a full deep dive on the podcast, and I'm very interested what your opinions are. What really happened to Miriam Rivera?
Was this young boy murdered in cold blood by his best friend, or was his death the result of a terrible accident? I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the death of Robert Houlihan. Robert was an 11-year-old boy living in the beautiful Cork Island. He was described as a very typical young boy. He was happy, he was cheery, he was cheeky, he absolutely loved spending time outdoors. He loved riding on his bike and riding horses. He would actually often go up to the stables to ride the horses, but also helped with all of the cleaning and mucking out of the stables. This is something that he absolutely loved to do. Robert was very much a mixer. He could talk to anyone and he could make friends wherever he went, and wherever he went, he always made himself comfortable. He would regularly visit his neighbour's house to see his best friend, but he considered this best friend more like an older brother. This was a man named Wayne O'Donoghue. Wayne was 21 years old in 2005 and was studying engineering at university. He would describe his relationship with Robert saying, quote, "I had known him for a number of years. He was a regular caller to the house and could call several times on any given day. I was a good friend of his. We played PlayStation as well as football and hurling." Robert and Wayne were really close, and when Wayne got his driving license and then eventually his car, he and Robert would often jump in the car to go to McDonald's to get milkshakes. And on the 4th of January 2005, Robert would turn up at Wayne's house in hopes of going and doing just that. This was actually the second time that Robert was turning up at Wayne's house asking to go out and get milkshakes, and it was the second time that Wayne refused. They then playfully swore at each other, which good friends, especially brothers, do, and Robert began to tease Wayne, picking up little pebbles and throwing them off of his car. But Wayne did not find this funny. He found this really annoying and irritating, and he was worried about his car, so he was telling Robert to stop it, to pack it in, but Robert wouldn't. He was very insistent about going for this milkshake. Wayne later described in his own words what happened, saying, quote, "I walked over to him and I put my right arm around his neck. I jerked him away from the bike towards the rear hand side of the car. I released the grip with my right hand and I was still holding him with my left hand by the scruff of the neck. Nothing was said between us at this stage. I then moved my left hand up to his Adam's apple. He was against the right rear hand side of my car. I said, 'Will you stop at the fucking stones?' I can't describe how tight I held him. I don't know how long I had him held. But it seemed very short. I did not intend to cause him any harm or injury. When I removed my left hand from his throat, he just fell to the ground." After this, Wayne went into a panic. He quickly picked up Robert's body and ran him upstairs to the bathroom, splashing Robert's face with cold water, shaking him, hoping that Robert would come around. But nothing was working. Robert's eyes remained closed and his body remained limp. He was gone. Wayne had killed him. Wayne would then wrap up Robert's body in black bin bags and forced him into the boot of his car. He then grabbed Robert's bike and chucked it in the back seat before speeding off. The bike would be dumped in a nearby ditch, and Wayne proceeded to drive outside of Middleton, which was the area that they lived in, and dumped Robert's body in some undergrowth. He would then go on about the rest of his day as if nothing had happened. He walked his dog, he spent some time with his girlfriend, he calmly ate his tea, and he even played on his PlayStation. He would later say that he only did this because he had to keep up appearances that everything was fine to squash any suspicions. However, what had happened was eating him up inside. Because of the guilt that he was claimed that he was feeling, Wayne decided to go back out to where he had dumped Robert's body. Wayne had theorised that because Robert's body was wrapped up in black bin bags, it would be harder for someone to discover, and he didn't want Robert's body laying there for a long amount of time. He wanted Robert to be discovered. So the best solution that he came up with was to set the bags on fire. A couple of hours later, Robert's mum would ring Wayne's house phone and asked Wayne if he had seen Robert anywhere. He hadn't came back home and she was very worried. He could hear in her voice that she was extremely concerned about her son. Wayne told her that yes, he had seen him earlier in the day, but not since then. What ensued after this was an 8-day search for 11-year-old Robert Houlihan. Over 700 volunteers aided in the search for the missing young boy, including Wayne and his brothers, who helped every single day of the search, and they would search for hours, sometimes staying up till 5 o'clock in the morning. However, on the 12th of January 2005, the search was called off. This came after Wayne approached the police and confessed to what he had done. His trial began around about a year later, where Wayne would plead not guilty to murder, but try to put forward a plea of manslaughter. This meant that he had to go through a trial. Robert's family had to sit through the entire thing, hearing all of the horrifying details of their son's death. which they very strongly did. They were in attendance for every single day of the 10-day trial, during which Wayne did appear to show regret, remorse, and sorry for what he had done. He took accountability for his actions and gave some insight into his mindset after what he had done. He admitted to the court that after he realised he had killed Robert, he was going to take his own life. He was stood with a knife at his throat, but he didn't do it. He didn't harm himself. He would explain why, saying, quote, "I don't know why I didn't. I was probably a coward. Something came over me, a family who loved me, and a girlfriend who I love." At the end of the trial, Wayne O'Donoghue was found guilty to the charge of manslaughter and handed a sentence of 4 years to serve for the death of 11-year-old Robert Houlihan. If you thought that sentence was incredibly low for literally taking another person's life, he didn't even serve that. He was released from prison a year early for good behaviour.
Have you guys heard about what the CIA did when they were running human experiments to figure out how to mind control? No? Okay, I'll tell you about it. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Cold War was at its peak. And the United States was convinced that they needed to do something big, something new that would give them a significant advantage over anyone. And the decision was made that that would be mind control. If they were able to develop mind control, it would prove to be extremely beneficial, especially in a war. Not only could they manipulate human behavior and rule the entire world, but they could also use it against their enemies in their favor to extract information and influence foreign leaders. They would have a one-up on everyone, and that was music to their ears. But in order to do so, it would take a lot of trial and error and testing and experiments to figure out what worked and what didn't. And for that reason, in 1953, Project MK came to be. The idea of it was to find unsuspecting persons, ordinary people. These were people such as unhoused people on the streets, prisoner, mentally ill patients, random civilians, at times even college students, children, all unwilling participants to take and conduct human experiments on. The target audience was later described to be, quote, people who could not fight back. And the experiments and the tests, by the way, had no limits. They were physical, mental, emotional. This went on from 1953 into the 1970s for 20 whole years, and it took millions and millions of dollars to fund. These experiments would take place in a variety of places, such as universities, research foundations. There are even some reports of some of them having happened in prisons. And in case it wasn't obvious, this was a top secret operation by the CIA. By the way, it was secretly funded. The entire thing being led by Sidney Gottlieb, an American chemist. Sidney Gottlieb was determined to find ways to manipulate, break down, and completely erase human consciousness. He wanted to figure out how to completely destroy human mind in order to then build it back up the way that he wanted to. And some of the things they were trying out were specifically they were also doing electroshock and sensory deprivation. Let's talk about one specific person that was experimented on, just to give you an idea of how these things happened, even though it happened differently for everyone because there was such a wide variety of tests and experiments and things. James Whitey Bulger. In the 1950s, James was serving time in prison when he volunteered for what he was told was a medical study to find a cure for schizophrenia. In exchange, they told him that he would get 3 days off of his sentence for every single month that he participated. Of course, there was no medical study. What actually happened was that James Bulger, along with 7 other inmates, were locked in a basement room every single week and given massive doses of. This is how James described it himself years later, quote, "In minutes, the would take over, and about 8 or 9 men, Dr. Pfeiffer and several men in suits who were not doctors, would give us tests to see how we reacted. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating, the room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even coming out of the walls, guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane." And while they were in this crazy, unstable state of mind, the supervising doctor would come in and start asking them leading questions such as, would you ever commit murder? What would you do? How would you do it? James experienced this more than 50 times, and prior to the experiments, he wasn't known to have murdered anyone. But after them, he is believed to have committed at least 11 murders. One of the jurors who convicted him in 2013 later on said that she regretted finding him guilty after finding out about everything that he was put through during MK Ultra. Information that his lawyers, for whatever reason, never brought up in trial. James was never the same person after this. He later wrote that the experiments completely destroyed his ability to sleep. He suffered nightmares, amongst other things, for the rest of his life. On a different occasion, Sidney Gottlieb decided not to test prisoners, but instead his own scientists that worked for him. He invited a group of them over to his house for, I think, some sort of dinner, and without their knowledge, he gave all of them Sydney wanted to do this because he wanted to be able to ask them questions about things that only they knew about to see if he could control their mind in the way that they answered these questions, and also to see if they would betray him and spill their secrets. When everyone began to feel weird and slowly but surely began to hallucinate, only then was Sydney like, oh yeah, I gave you all. Let's see what happens. One of the men at this dinner was Dr. Frank Olson. When the men realized what was going on, some of them handled it relatively well. 43-year-old Dr. Frank Olson was not one of them. Over the next 9 days after that night, Dr. Frank Olson felt like he was losing his mind. He told his wife that he had made a terrible mistake but never explained what he meant. He was agitated, he was paranoid, he felt like he was in a permanent state of confusion. So much so that he went back to Sydney Gottlieb and he was like, man, I am losing it, I don't know what to do. And Sydney was like, okay dude, no worries, we'll take you to go see a doctor. So he flew to New York, checked into a hotel room, and got ready to work with a psychiatrist to work on how to get his mind back to a normal state. But then on November 28th of 1953 at 2:25 in the morning, he jumps out from the 13th floor. He couldn't take it anymore. The CIA's official story was ruling it an unaliving following a fatal nervous breakdown. And for 22 years, Frank Olson's family did not know that he had been under CIA supervision when he passed. The man in the hotel room with him, Robert Lashbrook, was another CIA chemist, later claimed that he was asleep when Frank went out of the window. But one report that I read said that Robert didn't leave the room. He didn't call the police. Instead, he made a phone call to an unidentified CIA contact and said he's gone. In 1975, the government paid Frank Olson's family $750,000 to avoid a lawsuit. There were also different kinds of experiments, for example, using electroconvulsive therapy, which is like electrical currents being passed through the brain. They were doing that, but about 30 to 40 times its normal power. They were putting mentally ill patients into comas for weeks or months at a time. They were recording patients talking about their biggest fears and then replaying those recordings over and over and over again. Like they would take that recording, put speakers all over the room, like in the ceilings of the room, even putting speakers inside of their pillows. So the patients would just have to listen to themselves in their own voice talking about their biggest fears over and over and over again for days nonstop. The goal was literally to destroy a human brain and then figure out how to build it back up and rewire it in order to be able to control it. It's so horrible. Patients who were subjected to these experiments and these projects suffered from all kinds of issues for the rest of their lives, even forgetting how to talk, forgetting family members' names, forgetting everything, because they were just left in this permanent state of delusion, basically. MK Ultra came to an end when the president at the time, Nixon, fired the CIA's Inspector General in 1973 for being disloyal. The CIA's Inspector General, Richard Helms, was Sidney Gottlieb's right-hand man. And now with him being fired, Richard realizes that he is a problem. He is one of the only people who knows the full scope of what Sidney Gottlieb was doing during MK Ultra. He knows that if those files ever become public, people would probably go to prison, possibly including him. So before leaving the office, Richard Helms calls Sidney Gottlieb in for a meeting and they make a decision: destroy everything. Destroy as much evidence as they possibly could. Sidney Gottlieb personally drives out to the CIA Records Center and orders the staff to destroy boxes and boxes and boxes of MK Ultra files. And we're talking about records from at least 150 separate sub-projects spanning over 2 decades, mind you. And I hate to say it, but it worked. Sort of. I mean, not everything was completely destroyed because obviously we have some information. That is how I told you what I just told you, but that's probably not even the tip of the iceberg of what really went down, which is so scary to think about. It was honestly kind of hard finding information on this because I feel like there's obviously a limited amount of information. So if you guys do know about this and you happen to have some information that I didn't mention, please comment it because I'm so curious and scared. But that is it from me today. Thank you for spending time with me today. Hope you guys are having the best day. If not, go do something to make it the best day, make somebody happy, and I will see you in my next video. Massive kiss on the forehead to every single one of you.
It was a normal afternoon in Pennsylvania until a 5-year-old was pulled into a car and suddenly it was a race against the clock. Now, before I get into today's case, if you guys do prefer deep dives, I post a brand new podcast episode every week on the Bourne Investigation on Apple and Spotify. It was the 11th of July 2013 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was a gorgeous summer's day. Think birds tweeting, sun out in the sky, everybody out in their gardens having a nice time. And on this day in particular, little 5-year-old Jocelyn Rojas was at her Nan's house. She was just out in the garden, she was soaking up the rays, really enjoying herself, when an ice cream man showed up. Now, what a great addition to her day, right? I feel like we can probably all relate to being younger and hearing like an ice cream van pulling around the corner and just pestering our parents for money for ice cream. Except this was not a legit ice cream man. He didn't even have a van or any ice cream, just the promise of ice cream if she got in the car. This was a predator, and Jocelyn was too young to understand the dangers. It felt like in a matter of seconds she was snatched. Just 1 minute she was there, the next she was gone, bundled into a stranger's vehicle that had sped off at speed. Suddenly everyone was screaming, the whole neighborhood was frantic. Panicked fingers were dialing 911. It truly felt like an action film. It was a race against the clock to get that little girl back. Jocelyn's devastated family were urging police, please act as fast as you can. But they had no idea help would come from the most unlikely place. Now, the news spread that the guy who'd kidnapped the little girl was driving a purple sedan. It wasn't much to go off, but it was something. Police were out in force. There were almost 100 officers patrolling the area, swarming like bees. But they couldn't seem to spot the car. Then, 2 teenagers on bikes spotted something. Tamar Boggs, who was only 15, mind you, and his friend Chris Garcia saw a purple sedan. They didn't have time to ring police or call for backup, call for help. They needed to act fast. So they pedaled as fast as they could. And I've really heard things like this in emergency services where adrenaline takes over and you almost get like superhuman power and speed. They knew they couldn't lose this car. This was the chance to save that little girl's life. For over 15 minutes, they sped after this car and they were almost catching up to it. And soon the kidnapper inside of that car realized these kids ain't giving up. The kidnapper was so spooked that he pulled over and threw the little girl out of the car. The teenagers managed to grab her to safety, and honestly, nobody could believe this story. It had been 2 hours since she'd been kidnapped, and honestly, people were starting to lose hope. These young boys were local heroes. It was all over the news. It was such a crazy story. I mean, they just should have been so proud of their actions. I can't imagine what the parents of that young girl must have thought, like how grateful they must have been. But what about the aftermath? Obviously, the little girl was totally traumatized. I mean, she'd been saved, but she'd still been through something absolutely horrific. The culprit was tracked down, 73-year-old Harold Herr, and horrifically he admitted to essaying the child. He was eventually given 50 to 100 years in prison, but what enrages me the most about this case is the fact that he was known to police. In fact, he'd served 20 years in prison previously for child R in 1990. Why are these animals just let out? And the story kind of has a strange ending because Tamar, despite being this local hero, actually went down a bit of a dark path. He ended up being convicted of armed robbery, but he did show remorse and so was paroled in the end. What's that saying, like you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become a villain? Is that it? The only thing more baffling to me than missing persons cases are when that missing person then reappears over a decade later. She literally came back from the dead. She'd been declared legally dead years earlier. It was 2002 in Lititz in Pennsylvania. Brenda Heiss was a seemingly normal mother of 2 from the area who was working as an accountant. She had a son and a daughter aged 12 and 8. Now, on the day she vanished, everything seemed to be fairly normal. She put some food out to defrost later and she took her kids to school. She'd been doing a good job of keeping the normal household routine together despite the fact that she was actually going through a divorce. It kind of seemed to everybody like her kids were keeping her going, keeping her in a normal routine. That's why it was so worrying when she all of a sudden just vanished. She never picked her kids up from school that day. She never even contacted anybody to say where she was. Now, obviously, due to her recent divorce, police started looking immediately into her ex, her husband. As bad as it sounds, they were wondering if he had killed her out of anger, revenge, or for financial gain. But her husband Lee seemed just as confused as everybody else, to be fair, and just as eager to get her home. Months and months went by with absolutely no sign of the missing mother. There was also no sign of foul play, no reason to believe any harm had come to her. Years and years rumbled on, and eventually Lee actually went to court to have her declared legally dead. He was then obviously able to remarry if he wanted to. He was able to claim on her life insurance policy too. Now, this again did kind of raise some eyebrows in the community. Neighbours did feel kind of suspicious of him about this, but really nobody had any proof. And sadly, her children had come to terms with the fact that their mum wasn't coming home. That was until 11 years later. Bear in mind, her family really had moved on at this point. Her daughter Morgan was 19 years old. She was attending college. She'd had a whole chunk of her childhood without a mum, when all of a sudden, into a police station in Florida, walked Brenda. By this point, it was April 2013. So many years had gone by. She told police officers that she was a missing woman, and at first they were a little bit confused, but she gave them all her details. She then revealed her absolutely unbelievable story to authorities. She said the day that she vanished, she did so of her own accord. She'd suddenly randomly decided on the spur of the moment to join a bunch of hitchhikers who were homeless, who were moving to Florida. She decided to abandon her children to sleep on the streets and sometimes even scavenge in bins for food. She would sit on the street corners and beg for money. She'd obviously not told anyone her real name, and she'd just been sharing tents with strangers and sleeping rough. And the only reason she wanted to hand herself in was that she was tired of being homeless. And when her children found out, they were understandably pretty upset and angry and reluctant to reunite with her. And honestly, I don't know how I would deal with that. I don't know how I would process that information. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think you would ever be able to forgive your mum for doing that?